So I will spotlight you now, Giovanni.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Thanks for the invitation and congratulations for your stamina. You're making it all the way from midnight to midnight. That's great.
I have
great.
to say there's another Vlad that's also seems to have been here the whole way around as well. So he'll get a round of applause at the end too.
Right. So divergent creativity estimation, what does that mean really? What do we mean by that? Because you surely have heard about divergent thinking, but perhaps you have not heard about divergent creativity estimation. What is the meaning of that? In order to discuss that, I'm going to start from the definition of creativity. You know, there are many definitions out there in the literature, and there is one definition which is called the so-called standard definition of creativity, and that foresees that creativity is a phenomenon with two requirements. We need to identify the existence of originality and effectiveness for us to see creativity. Originality really means three things. We need novelty, but something can be new and not original. I buy a new car, it's new, but it's not an original idea and an original product. You need surprise for something to be original. It must be unexpected. Otherwise, if it's already expected, there is no originality. And the third element in originality is authenticity. So something original is new, surprising, and authentic, but still that is not enough to define creativity, because something could be original and completely devoid of any value. So we also want effectiveness, but effectiveness depends on the domain. So if you're working in the arts, there must be some form of aesthetic value, and that is going to determine your effectiveness. If you're working in science, it's probably going to be elegance, explanation power of a theory or a formula. If you're working in engineering, effectiveness might be power consumption, performance, and so on. So depending on the creative domain that you're interested in, effectiveness will change its specific meaning. But in general, it's the value, the utility, the usefulness recognized by people out there. But that is really the problem, because when you want to understand the phenomenon, you want to study the phenomenon, for example, from a psychological point of view, you want to measure creativity. And now the problem is, who is going to judge originality and effectiveness? Who are the judges that can provide an objective measure of originality and effectiveness? Is this really possible? There have been several attempts. Of course, one of the most classic tests of divergent thinking is the alternative uses test, which belonged already to the Torrance test. And the two authors, Wallach and Kogan, in 1965, so a long time ago, tried to find an objective measure for creativity of these responses. And actually, this book that they published in 65 was very influential for a long time. Essentially, they understood creativity as uniqueness of the response. So when they were scoring these alternative uses tasks for divergent thinking, they were counting the responses, so fluency, and they were giving 1 point to those responses that were unique in the sample, and 0 points to the other responses that were, say, doubles or triples inside the sample. And as I said, this approach had many followers for many years, but then we understood that it was not correct because of two problems. First of all, fluency and uniqueness are confounded because the larger the number of responses you provide, the larger the probability that at least one or a few of these responses will be unique. So there is no real separation in terms of explanatory power between the measure of fluency and the measure of uniqueness. But the most significant problem of this approach was that uniqueness and sample size were confounded. So the smaller the sample size, the larger the probability that some responses would be unique, and vice versa. If you're using larger sample sizes that would provide better statistics, it would decrease the probability to have unique responses. So clearly this approach was flawed. And some 20 years later, Amabile came out with the CAT, the Consensual Assessment Technique, essentially coming to the idea that in order to judge these ideas, you needed a panel of experts. And so a product or response would be creative if these experts would agree that it is actually creative. And this is also a very followed approach even today, and there have been many, many variations on the theme. But I would like to say that there is still some problem even in this case, because if you look at the history of the arts, of science and technology, the really disruptive ideas, the really great ideas that came out of creative genius were the ones that were welcomed with disruption in the field and not agreement. So really creative ideas are so disruptive in the field that the experts in general do not agree on their value. And thinking about the pragmatist approach to the definition of what an entity, what an object can be considered to be, for the pragmatists, you should try to conceive all the possible effects, all the possible meanings that might have a practical bearing on reality, and the overall cloud of all these possible meanings and interpretations and values and attributes and functionalities. That entire cloud makes up what we know about the object, which means that to judge a creative idea, you need to be able to take on an indefinite number of points of view. And nobody has the resources, nobody has the time to be able to do that. Which means, on the other hand, that any judgment, any assessment of a creative idea will always be partial and will always be subjective, depending on your knowledge structure, on your position in the field, on your competition between the creator of the idea and the judge himself or herself, and so on. So we need to provide a definition that is able to allow for this subjectivity, and that does not require that we recognize originality and effectiveness here and now. Also because creative ideas are projected into the future. So the real value and all those viewpoints that I was telling you about are viewpoints of the future. Especially disruptive ideas might reveal their value, their real effectiveness, some tens or sometimes hundreds of years later after they have been generated. And there are many, many possible, plausible, and probable futures. So future studies as a discipline teaches us that we can open up many, many alternative scenarios, and we can even design preferable futures, which is the green part in this graph, and then work back a strategy in order, this is of course in the case of business, in order for our business to reach that preferable future. So the modification of the definition that we need to introduce in order to allow us to recognize that creativity exists, even though originality and effectiveness might not be recognized here and now, is potential. So creativity requires that there is a potential for originality and the potential for effectiveness. The potential is larger, the larger the challenge that you are throwing at the state of the art. There is no guarantee that when you get out of the comfort zone or out of the common knowledge domain, that you will find creative ideas, but you have a large potential. And in this dynamic creativity framework that we have defined based on this definition, there are two ways to estimate. Now we don't judge creativity anymore, but we estimate the potential of an idea. One modality which is convergent with respect to the initial focus, I was trying, for example, to write a poem, and is this a good poem? Or I was trying to solve a problem. Did I solve that problem? But also we have another modality, which is divergent creativity estimation, which means to estimate the potential for originality and effectiveness of the idea that you generated with respect to any possible future, any possible functionality, any possible application, any possible dynamic development. So you allow yourself to find something that you were not looking for in a non-linear way, a posteriori, after the idea has been generated. You allow yourself to try to find values that were not foreseen a priori. And this is why we say this is the home of serendipity. And let me conclude by just giving you a very famous example. So suppose you're a chemical engineer and you're given the task to design the strongest glue in the world, and you try your best, but the outcome is very, very poor. So poor that the glue you designed is very weak, so weak that if you put it between two sheets of paper and you pull the sheet of paper, then these two sheets of paper, they just divide, they separate. So the glue is very, very, very weak. But you might apply divergent creativity estimation and see that you could use that weak glue for another application, which became the Post-it note. And this is actually how the Post-it note was developed inside the 3M company, out of a mistake or a failed design of a very strong glue. But thanks to a divergent creativity estimation exercise, a new product that revolutionized the world and also the world of brainstorming, as we see in this picture, came out. So thank you very much for your attention. We will be waiting for you in Bologna at the Villa Grifone, the home of Guglielmo Marconi, which is also the premises of the Marconi Institute for Creativity. And thank you, Wendy, for the time.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Giovanni. And I believe that you still have your call for abstracts for your Bologna conference is still open, isn't it, for another about week or so?
It's still open until June 15th. So there's a conference on creativity that will happen in September from the 8th to the 10th of September. So you're all very welcome to come and contribute to the conference. Thank you, Wendy, for remembering that.
It's definitely one of the best ones. So it's, yes, I fully recommend if you have any thoughts that you might do it. And you're doing it mixed modality, aren't you, Giovanni? So
absolutely. So it could also be physical. You could actually come to Bologna, or you can be online. Yes.
That's fantastic. Did anybody have any questions for Giovanni? You can feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute. So I had a question. I didn't know whether you were here this morning. Well, you weren't here this morning, but what I thought was we had a talk from someone called Eric Ritschel. I can't say his surname, sorry. And he was talking about basically getting people to rate answers to alternative uses tasks. And Margaret Webb did a similar thing. So is that, because when you talk about measuring this divergent creativity, how would you get people to do that? Is that sort of how would you put that about? What method would you use?
Yeah, when you try to give a score to an alternative use, you're clearly trying to build the statistics, and there's a purpose for that because you're trying to understand the phenomenon from a psychological or perhaps a neuroscientific point of view. So that is all very well, but in the real world, the value of the idea cannot be given a score. The value of a creative product cannot really be given a score. It's a dynamic phenomenon. And if you want to extract in an active way, because it's not a passive, there's nothing objective there. If you want to extract the maximum value from any idea that is offered to you, you must put yourself at the same level. So for example, if you're a teacher in a classroom, you forget you're a teacher, and you're at the same level of your pupils or your students, and you put more energy into the process. So you keep refining and extracting value, for example, by comparing the idea to existing elements of the world and finding differences. or asking yourself, what problem a posteriori does this idea solve? And what desires does it satisfy? So the dynamic estimation exercise is something that extracts and refines the idea as you perform that exercise. So it's not really, it's very far from giving a score and say, this is it, this is an idea which is worth 2.5, but it's a process in which you engage with the idea, you engage with the creator, and you give your own energy and contribution to the development of the idea in a very dynamic way. I guess you're muted now, Wendy.
I'm still, because I have a train that I live on a train track, so I have to keep muting when a train comes past, and then I forget that I've done it. Mihaela's got a question for you.
Great.
Thank you very much for the presentation. What sort of timescales are you looking at to measure the estimates for these potentials?
That's a very good question, because the time scale are a critical element whenever you consider dynamics. So we have both short scale, real time refinement of the ideas, as well as very, very long-term developments. So in the theory that we have developed in comparison between intelligence construct and creativity constructs, we talk about tight time and loose time. And depending on the tightness and looseness of time of the time domain, as well as the tightness and looseness of the conceptual space domain, you identify 4 quadrants with very different styles and dominance of intelligence or creativity, with clear separation between the 2 constructs. So both tight time and loose time are important for analysis, but clearly the most creative work comes out in the loose space, loose time domain, when the constraints are looser, even though we have heard in the talk before this session that to work without constraints is very, very difficult. You must have very strong motivation, and in some way you must play with your own constraints, even though the world is not putting them on you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. And that then brings us right back to what Todd was talking about. This is a model this quadrant you're developing with Todd Lubart, yes? Because he was talking about that this morning. So you've managed to bookend our paper talks like that. So fantastic. Thank you very much, Giovanni. Thank you. And I really